Finding health and peace through self-care. A massage, a bubble bath, and a glass of wine. Would that be your idea of a good time? Most people would classify these activities as self-care. Secular society encourages us to indulge. Self-care is often equated with hashtags such as treat yourself and you deserve it. But to what end? What is the Christian perspective of self-care? Doesn't Jesus say in Matthew 16:24, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me"? Is self-care selfish? I know what it means to not take care of myself, physically and mentally. There's a psychological disorder that involves a negative relationship with food and exercise that I used to identify very strongly with. In fact, my eating disorder used to be all that I was. I found my identity in my sickness. Ironically, my mental illness was encouraged by my theological understanding of Matthew 16:24. I believed that self-denial negated self-care. Through self-deprivation, I believed I was following the will of God. In the end, I instigated a war with myself. Through my lived experience and research on the subject, I now believe that one component of achieving inner peace is through practicing healthy self-care. With inner peace comes the potential for peace with one another. Best of all, self-care practices are not only encouraged, but actually endorsed by God. In order to come to this conclusion, I will first establish how health is connected to peace. I will then redefine our understanding of self-care as an extension of our relationships and share how self-care can result in creating peace in larger communities. Health can be understood as a state of shalom. Shalom is a Hebrew word that means peace and encompasses inner completeness and tranquility. From this perspective, mental and spiritual wellness are linked with peace. Daniel O'Neill wrote in the Christian Journal for Global Health that the definition of health from a biblical perspective goes beyond, quote, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, unquote, as outlined by the World Health Organization. Health includes the restoration of relationships, our relationships with ourselves, with others, and with God. The recipe for healthy self-care is found when these three types of relationships are put into equally valued portions. In his book, Becoming Human, Jean Vanier reveals that love and acceptance of ourselves is the beginning of forgiveness. Furthermore, Vanier says, to forgive is to work for peace. From Vanier, we can infer that accepting ourselves is a means of achieving peace. Vanier also says that it's only through the adoption of an attitude of love for one another and ourselves that peace can be achieved. From my own experience, I know this to be true. When my relationship with myself was placed on the same continuum as my relationship with God and others, I found self-acceptance. By further rooting my faith in my relationship with God, I discovered my true identity and also achieved an inner sense of peace. Knowing myself and being at peace with my identity encourages me to now create peace with those around me, and this is now further achieved through community. In her book, 4 Gifts, April Yamasaki acknowledges how self-care is practiced in community. Reading 4 Gifts shows that self-care is ordained by God. In Matthew 12:31, it is written, "Love your neighbor as yourself." This passage is often interpreted to mean that humans must always put their neighbors before themselves. But Yamasaki argues that love for neighbor and self should occur at the same time. There needs to be a balance found between these two components. They are not mutually exclusive, but rather symbiotic and actually mutually reinforcing. Yamasaki says, quote, "In navigating between these two poles, I find the place of authentic and wholesome self-care." End quote. Self-care is often assumed to involve luxurious pampering and can be associated with feelings of guilt from an abundance of pleasure. But self-care does not even necessarily mean putting yourself first. Yamasaki redefines our understanding of self-care and reminds us that even Jesus practiced self-care. For Jesus, Self-care was taking time to pray whenever possible. Through prayer, Jesus prioritized building his relationship with God. The Bible holds many examples of people that practiced self-care. Moses, Mary, and Paul are just a few characters from the biblical narrative that set boundaries, sought out companionship, and asked for help as ways of taking care of themselves. God endorses self-care. It is our understanding of self-care that needs a little bit of work. Yamasaki says, given the core commitments that shape our lives, I understand healthy self-care as a me too rather than a me first or me not at all. Friendship with God and with others is a form of self-care. Thus, in caring for others, we learn how to better care for ourselves. In fulfilling God's commission to love our neighbors as ourselves, we are actually practicing self-care. When we care for others, when we care for ourselves, in the form of connecting deeply with the people around us, we also find a sense of belonging. Belonging is at its best when it is also accompanied by balance and boundaries. Self-care involves recognizing your limits and establishing borders, because not all relationships are life-giving, and it is also perfectly fine to enjoy a glass of wine in moderation. When you can be honest with those around you because you feel like you belong, time by yourself is not segregating, but rather rejuvenating. Time with yourself is a necessary component of life, but if a person does not feel like they belong to a group beyond themselves, time alone can be isolating and depressing. Time alone can then feel selfish. There is an antidote for this feeling of selfishness, and Jean Vanier says it can be found in belonging. Furthermore, Vanier says, quote, "It is only through belonging that we can break out of the shell of individualism and self-centeredness that both protects and isolates us." End quote. Community reveals God's love and acts as a form of self-care while preventing us from becoming selfish. So is self-care selfish? If practicing community is the most important part of self-care, then you tell me. April Yamasaki recognizes that we all need to rely on God to provide for our needs. If God is to be the center of our lives, God must also be the motivation behind our self-care. God wants us to form a relationship with Him, and in doing so, God promises to provide for our needs. This is what I missed in Matthew 16:24. I thought I had to do it all myself. Denying yourself does not mean depriving yourself, but rather valuing your relationship with God and others and finding your identity in that relationship. God says you need to practice self-care in relationship with God and with one another. Anything is possible with God, but following God does require some effort on your part too. And that's where our call to peace comes into play. As outlined in Matthew 12:31, we are called to care for one another in order to work for peace. Vanier recognizes that in order to care for others, we need to find ways to properly care for ourselves. This is a balancing act that is best practiced with the guidance of God. God's will can best be understood through prayer and time spent intentionally building relationships with others and with God. Without God, we are all hungry in the midst of a battle. In finding peace with ourselves through healthy self-care practices, we can work towards peace with others. Practice self-care today. Spend time with family. Call a friend. Create community. Take time to pray. You'll find shalom in the process. Thank you.